Good evening. My name is Alex Pivovarsky. I work here at the EBRD, where I lead the team responsible for supporting our country's efforts to develop financial and capital markets. I'm also from Ukraine. Marcus Warren, who was planning to launch today's event, could not be here today, and I was delighted to be able to step in. First of all, I would like to welcome you all here. And looking at the guest list, it is clear that very few of you need an introduction to our bank. However, let me say just a few words about us in particular as they relate to the topic of this year's lecture, focusing on the future of the rules-based order. We were established in 1991 as a development bank, or rather an institutional investor with a development mandate to help support transition to post-socialist economies to market economy, in particular by helping nurture their nascent, at that time, private sectors. Today, we are owned by almost 80 countries from 5 continents, as well as the European Union and the European Investment Bank. We invest across almost 40 emerging economies across 3 continents and have recently added Iraq, as well as 5 sub-Saharan African countries, and hope soon to welcome another sub-Saharan African country to our list of countries of operations. Since our inception, we invested the cumulative amount of 210 billion euros in 7,500 projects in our countries of operations. Beyond our investments, we care about the institutional environment of the countries where we operate, aiming to foster a well-run, sustainable, and competitive economy through our unique business model, where we combine our funding with technical assistance and support of policy reforms. As an international institution, we are a beneficiary of the rules-based international order. Supporting cross-border investment and trade has been central to our development mandate. And international investment and trade flows very much depend on predictable and stable international rules of engagement. Unfortunately, we have been very much affected by the breakdown of post-World War II rules, and in particular by Russia's annexation of parts of Ukraine in 2014, and more recently by Russia's war of aggression. The impact on us was felt in many ways, including through breakdown of investment and trade flows, but also through the impact on our staff and their families. At the same time, as a development bank, we had to engage in an effort to undo the damage of war and to compensate for the breakdown of the rules-based order. More specifically, at the EBRD, we are proud to have been able to support Ukraine in wartime by scaling up our operations there since 2022. Much of our effort was focused on helping rebuild energy and other infrastructure destroyed by the war. We have supported also private sector clients and financial institutions. Like BEARR Trust, we have also mobilized significant funds to support Ukraine's civil society and various charitable causes. For example, the EBRD has been fundraising for Kids and Art in Ukraine project, and you could admire their art outside after the event. At the same time, we are pursuing preparations for engaging in the future reconstruction of Ukraine, including through the bank's capital increase that would provide additional resources for us to scale up our efforts there when peace returns. However, our ability to help rebuild Ukraine, but also to support development in our many other countries of operations, will very much depend on the answer to the question to be discussed in today's lecture. Will we be able to reestablish the rules-based international order? Therefore, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ross Gill for his opening remarks on behalf of BEARR Trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for supporting the BEARR Trust and joining us once again this year for this year's annual lecture, and it's great to see so many people here this evening. Once again, we're very grateful to the EBRD for their support in sponsoring this occasion, which they have done for several years now, and for enabling us to use this wonderful venue. And if you get a chance when it gets dark towards the end, have a look at the view from the window. Many of you will have been friends of the BEARR Trust for several years. Some of you may have been friends of the BEARR Trust for so long that you might remember that back in 2011, BEARR's 20th anniversary lecture was also held at the EBRD, hosted by the EBRD, and Dr. Bobo Lo spoke about, at that time, Russia and the New World Disorder, looking ahead perhaps to some of the times that we're living in now. And he was also introduced at that time by Sir Roderic Lyne, so we have a good track record here. But I'm sure there'll also be some of you here who will be joining us for the first time, maybe don't know quite so much about BEARR and what we do. The BEARR Trust has been in existence for about as long as the EBRD, so we were founded in the early 1990s as well. And we exist to support civil society organisations working with vulnerable people in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We believe that grassroots, community-led organisations are often those that are most responsive to local needs, often the most able to achieve change in their communities. And they're also often the people that are there for the long term, after others have perhaps left. We support those community-based organisations with small amounts of seed corn funding to help make a difference on the ground, and we support networking activity as well within the countries that we operate and within the UK. We're working in challenging times, or perhaps more specifically, our partners in those community organisations are working in challenging times. In 2022, following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we launched an appeal to help our partners provide emergency assistance. You'll have seen on the slide deck that we're showing at the start some of the beneficiaries of that assistance and some of the people that we helped. This year, we relaunched this as our Ukraine Community Resilience Fund, supporting psychological and therapeutic support and other assistance where it's needed the most. So far, since 2022, we've sent well over £600,000 to communities in Ukraine and Moldova. War in Ukraine, of course, continues, and in some other parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, many of our partners are faced with other challenges, including rising authoritarianism and pressure on civil society. So in that context, BEARR's support is needed more than ever. The money that we raise to support our work comes from the generosity of many other charitable organisations and many individual donors as well, and it all goes to support our work with communities. Thank you all very much for your support, and please do join us after the discussion this evening for refreshments. So I'm delighted to welcome Bobo Lo and Kadri Liik to this evening's discussion, and also at this point to introduce Sir Roderic Lyne, a BEARR Trust patron and the former British ambassador to Moscow. I know it's going to be a fascinating discussion, and I very much look forward to it, and I'll hand you over to Roderic now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross. I'll be very brief because I'm just here as the quiz master. Many thanks to the EBRD for hosting this once again. Particular thanks to all of you. To have a wonderful audience like this is a vote of confidence in BEARR and a huge support to them. Kadri Liik has spent most of last night on an aeroplane, has come specially from Thailand to be here, and she's already 2 hours ahead of us in her body clock. And she is going to be working in harness with Bobo to address the very simple question of, is it all over for the rules-based international order? I'm not going to give a lengthy CV of either of our speakers, because if you didn't know who they are, you wouldn't have come. But Bobo has pleaded with me to give a plug for the book that he has coming out in 2 weeks' time, which is called The Disorderly Society, Rethinking Global Governance in an Age of Anarchy. It's being brought out by Agenda Publishing. It's Bobo's 7th book. Many of you will remember his seminal work on Russia and China, Axis of Convenience, which is one of the very first books that I'm aware of that seriously investigated in contemporary times that very important relationship, never more important than now. So the way we're going to run it is that Bobo is going to give you a potted version of his book for just a few minutes, his excellent book, which I spent this afternoon reading. Kadri will then follow Bobo. Then the three of us will have a bit of a conversation. Then I will open it out to all of you. And then you get to the good bit of the evening, which is drinks afterwards. And you can then quiz Bobo and Kadri further on their deep thoughts. So with no further ado, Bobo, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Roderic, and thank you to the BEARR Trust. It's a great honor to be here today. So, the theme, is it all over for the rules-based international order? Well, let's start off with a proposition. The world today is more disorderly and anarchic than at any time since the end of the Second World War. The US-led rules-based international order, in my view, has unraveled, yet no alternative has emerged in its place. The UN-based order that a lot of people talk about is a fiction. The multipolar order, or some call it a concert of great powers, is an aspiration rather than a reality. Xi Jinping's shared future for humanity is a concept essentially without detail, without substance. And Donald Trump's America First vision offers little or nothing to other players, and so is unsustainable. More generally, there is no consensus about the rules of engagement and coexistence today. International law has given way to the rule of lawlessness. We are living in a Hobbesian state of nature. And meanwhile, the world faces a perfect storm of threats and challenges. Runaway climate change, the threat of more frequent and more serious pandemics, stagnant global poverty, a technological transformation without parallel, mass disinformation, and then the old chestnut, geopolitical confrontation. So I argue in my book that revitalizing global order is the central task of our time, not because order is intrinsically virtuous, but because without some measure of order, we will scarcely be able to tackle the enormous threats and challenges that face us today. But it is evident that the usual prescriptions are unfit for purpose. We clearly need to rethink global governance because as the world changes, so must the nature and shape of order itself. But what does that mean in practice? Well, in the book, I advocate a new internationalism based on three broad principles. The first is a larger view of self-interest. The second is greater representativeness and inclusiveness. And the third is the acceptance of flexibility and diversity. I'll dig a little bit deeper on each of those now. Now, self-interest is the foundation of any international order and has been so for at least 2,000 years. So it's pointless, especially today, to talk about transcending self-interest. It is possible, and indeed necessary, to reconceptualize self-interest. And three elements are critical here. The first is to recognize the interconnectedness of things. Yes, the world appears more fractured and divided than at any time since the end of the Cold War. But we are more interconnected, more globalized, more interdependent than we have ever been. Our self-interest, whether we like it or not, is intimately connected to the self-interest of others, including our enemies and rivals and competitors. The second element of a new self-interest is a proper grasp of time. What does that mean? Well, really it is about understanding that threats can be both urgent, immediate, and yet also long-term. And climate change is a classic example of this. But understanding time is also about persevering in policy implementation. And this is especially critical, not just in mitigating climate change, but again in conflict resolution. So take the latest Gaza deal. This deal will count for nothing unless we understand that we are in for the long haul. And then the third element of self-interest is practical empathy. This is not about singing kumbaya and holding hands and being happy-clappy. Empathy should never be confused for endorsement or approval. It's about putting yourself in the shoes of the other guy, about understanding why they act in certain ways, and then responding accordingly. Empathy is key to collective problem solving. The second element of a new internationalism is greater representativeness and inclusiveness. And this really is indispensable to the functioning of any order. An unrepresentative order is a contradiction in terms. By ignoring the self-interest of the many, it sets itself up to fail. And there are two key priorities here. One is rectifying the underrepresentation of global South countries in international institutions. So if we, Western democracies, want global South to pay attention to issues such as Ukraine, then we have to involve them more in decision-making. And it's interesting, again, returning to the Gaza deal. Yes, so much attention has been focused on Donald Trump, but this deal would never have happened without the detailed, intense involvement of global South countries like Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. And then the second related priority is a policy agenda that reflects the priorities of the many rather than the few. We cannot expect global South countries to be interested in US-China geopolitics or Putin's war in Ukraine if we show no interest in the priorities that matter to them, for example, climate financing or debt relief. And then the third element of the new internationalism is flexibility and diversity. A flexible international order would dispense with the illusion of universal values. It would recognize the existence of multiple and often contradictory value systems. It would focus on what states do in the international arena rather than on their mode of domestic governance. Now, as a liberal, I find this painful. But in fact, there is no alternative. And incidentally, it's not true that authoritarian regimes invariably behave aggressively in foreign policy, any more so than democracies. That might be true of Russia, but I would argue it's certainly not true of China. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that this vision of new internationalism is going to sort of come up against cold, hard reality. And you may well be right. That may well turn out to be the case. Because, let's face it, today, the global picture looks especially grim. However, we should not be so quick to dismiss the prospects of a re-emerging international society. What looks improbable today may, in fact, be more possible than you think under the pressure of changing circumstances. Think about the sudden end of the Cold War, Franco-German entente after 2 centuries of enmity, German reunification, or China's spectacular rise from the depths of the Cultural Revolution. As the existential nature of challenges like climate change, technological transformation, and major power confrontation become inescapable, governments will, despite themselves, have to find ways of working together. And there's an analogy here with the aftermath of the Second World War, when countries, governments of very, very different stripes came together to rebuild a global order. It has been done before, and it can be done again. So, to sum up, to answer the exam question, the rules-based international order, designed and dominated by the West, is over and cannot be revived. That was the product of a unique combination of power, vision, and will. However, a new rules-based international order is possible, one that is flatter and fairer, that enjoys greater legitimacy and accountability, and that is ultimately more resilient and more effective. In any case, we have no choice but to attempt the enterprise. Because the problem with determinism or fatalism, it's not just cowardly, it's hopelessly impractical. And so is relying on approaches that are either past their use-by date, lack substance, or are a one-way ticket to more chaos and anarchy. So the new internationalism that I advocate reflects the reality that we either live and flourish by working together to meet common threats and challenges, or we go down divided. We are not obliged to accept a dystopian future. We are the masters of our fate. We have agency, and it's high time we acted on it. I'll leave it there.
Kadri, your turn.
Thank you. I don't have a lecture, so I will not walk up to the lectern. And Bobo, fantastic what you have done with your book. I just offer some reflections on rules-based international order, and I'm afraid I mostly have worries to share. I'm not sure I have an optimistic message. So I do fear that it is all over for the rules-based order as we have known it, or what we have called rules-based order during the past 3 decades, the post-Cold War international order, America-led liberal. I think that is over. And I think inevitably there will be a new order, but what worries me is the question if Europe is capable of shaping that new order in a meaningful manner. And I have my doubts about that. I think Europe is less well equipped to cope with the changes than many other countries in the world. And that is because Europe is still a very normative power. In a way, Europe is the last bastion of rules-based international order. America, that was underpinning that order, is moving away, but Europe has nowhere to move. Because Europe, especially European Union, is itself a product of that order and very normative in its whole setup, its embodiment of rules-based order. So my friend and colleague Ivan Krastyev has actually made that comparison between European elites and Soviet elites. A few weeks before Trump was elected, he said that it could be that when Trump is elected, all of us will suddenly feel the way Soviet communists felt in '91. Suddenly things are happening that you didn't expect. Suddenly things are done and being talked about that didn't seem possible. I mean, think of a communist establishment in Moscow seeing how Estonia wants economic self-governance, someone else is already establishing joint enterprises with Finland, and they don't care what Lenin would say about it or what was the decision about the latest party congress. They just go into their own thing. So the whole normative setup that used to guide everything is suddenly rejected. And sadly, but I think Ivan, he's often right, and I'm afraid he was right on that the liberal establishment is just operating in a framework that much of the rest of the world has abandoned. Yeah. Another thing, I think, at times like Greece, that liberal establishment has an instinct then to double down on its norms and principles. And I can see that in many places in Europe. People become very rigid, very defensive about their worldview. And I can understand that, but in a way, a more pragmatic way would be to seek allies. Maybe look at lowest common denominator, seek allies in unexpected places. Don't try to enforce the whole world to subscribe to your principles. I think that may have been the mistake the West made in maintaining liberal international order. But try to be flexible. Try to find allies, and I don't see how the European Union can do it because it's not an agile geopolitical actor. And it's not transactional, you know. It cannot make a deal with some global south country saying that at that UN vote, why don't you vote against Russia and we will provide you with that and that and that. We could try, but then there will be organizations and people in our own society saying that, but no, this country is bad because they cut down rainforest and they are producing fur coats and they are doing all sorts of things that many in our societies don't think are good. And they are right. Probably all these things would be happening. Yeah. But what can we do about it? And we miss a potential ally. So I think European Union really finds it hard to shape the order that is about to come. And I think it is especially true of countries like mine. I mean, East European countries that entered the European Union in 2004, because we came in as a rule takers. Rules were already done, they were there. And we were happy to adopt. And Estonia was so proud that we qualified to all rules, norms, got accepted to European Union, NATO. You know, qualifying and making it became our way of doing things. But we were not there when the order was shaped. We haven't faced the hard choices at different junctions. We were not in the shoes of John Kennedy during Cuban missile crisis. We were not in the shoes of Urho Kaleva Kekkonen in Finland during all the difficult choices that Finland had to make in it, managing its relationship with the Soviet Union. So for us, rules-based order was a sort of God-given order, and all you need to do is to defend it. But someone needs to create it, that someone needs to adjust it, shape it, fine-tune it. I'm not sure we have properly understood it. And I recently read, there was an article in Foreign Policy about Kaja Kallas, my compatriot, whom I respect, who is High Representative at the European Union. And there was a quote that a cop rather than a diplomat. That may have been meant as an insult, and I don't subscribe to the insult, but I think there was also something very revealing about it. I think the instinct in many people in our countries is exactly to adopt the position of a cop in defending the liberal international order, punish the ones who preach it, and but we are not equally well equipped to think creatively how to adapt it, how to develop it further so that it would be fit for the times to come. Maybe I stop here. We can talk about Russia.
Sure. Can I pick up one of the rather trenchant points made by Bobo, throw it first at you and then ask Bobo to defend his thesis? He says we should deprioritize universal values. Universal values lie at the heart of the European Union, NATO, of course the Helsinki process. Bobo says that instead we should prioritize the sovereign rights of nations and the principle of non-interference. That's a quote from his book. Now that to me sounds like not going forwards, it's going backwards. It reminds me very much of Andrei Gromyko. And indeed, it is a description of the Westphalian system. Yeah. Kadri, from an Estonian perspective, do you really think that we should abandon humanitarian values, the values of the Enlightenment, as easily as that, and simply say, as Gromyko would have had us say, and as Lavrov, let alone Putin, would have us say, what we do in our own country is our business and no business of yours?
Yeah, indeed. That is a very Russian view of the world. I mean, Russia, there is an Estonian scholar, Lauri Mälksoo, who has studied Russian views on international law, and his thesis is that Russia likes the international law of 1945, but not the international law of 1989 and onwards, because the latter relies too much on universal values and prioritizes universal values over state sovereignty, which Russia is not happy with at all. I think we shouldn't deprioritize them, but we should definitely defend them when it comes to our own countries and where we can. But I think we should give up the notion that we can reshape the world
exactly
to match our values, because we have tried, and it actually resulted. Result was not good. I mean, I'm afraid we made the world more dangerous and
let me ask Bobo to defend himself. Bobo, can you apply your proposition to apartheid in South Africa? We should say, that's fine, you're a sovereign country. We're not going to put pressure on you because what you're doing is internal?
I think that's pretty much what the United States did during the Cold War. They didn't, and that's what...
No, you're getting off the way. I'm not talking about Cold War, I'm talking about apartheid. Don't wriggle out.
But I don't recall Margaret Thatcher putting much pressure on South Africa. I don't recall Ronald Reagan putting much pressure on South Africa. So that's exactly what they were doing. They gave them, if not an entirely a free pass, they gave them a lot of latitude. And this is the problem. The problem today is that we forgive the trespasses of our friends, and we come hard on those we dislike. So we tolerate human rights abuses in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, but we hammered China over the treatment of the Uyghurs. I'm not trying to justify the treatment, China's abysmal treatment of the Uyghurs, but let's be honest. What Sisi has done in Egypt, some of the brutal repression that we have seen in other allies. We've tolerated the backsliding of Indian democracy because we think, we need India as a counterweight to China. And all this is going on when we are selective about how we judge our own democratic standards. So it strikes me as the height of absurdity at a time when we're seeing the dismantling of American democratic norms and institutions and the rule of law, for the West then to sort of pick on global South countries for their backsliding on democracy or their repressive practices. I'm not trying to justify.
So are we wrong to sanction North Korea, to take another example?
What's the point? What's the point of sanctioning North Korea?
So you would admit them to the international community in a way they're rather excluded at the moment?
No, because the problem with North Korea that we have is the way they engage with other countries in the region. What North Korea does in North Korea, we could just about live with if they weren't such a disruptive actor in Northeast Asia. That's my main problem with North Korea. We should judge the behavior of countries primarily by how they engage with other countries, other states, what their impact on international order is. Because that's really what is of most direct concern to us. That matters. For example, take China. What China does in the South China Sea, I think, is far more consequential for international order than what it does in Xinjiang, as deplorable as that is. And then there's another issue, which is that the rest of the world looks at us, looks at the West, and they think we're a bunch of raving hypocrites. I'm sorry. They say, your liberal values, they're good for you, but they're not our values. The so-called universal values incorporated in the UN Charter, they were established at a time when there were 51 countries in the world, most of which were in Europe, America, Australia, and Latin America. The world is completely changed. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, 9-person panel headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, only one person was not from a Western country or not educated in the United States.
I want to move the conversation on because we're short of time.
Yeah.
You've defended your position very robustly, though I would point out that all the countries that subsequently joined the UN signed up to the UN Charter and signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
What choice did I have? What choice? Seriously, Rob?
Can I move on to another question, a completely different one? You didn't mention migration, but as you're looking at this world of anarchy, one of the most anarchic elements of it is mass migration flows that are highly disruptive and that we are certainly nowhere near controlling, and which in some cases certainly test our adherence to international rules and norms. And the tensions which these migratory flows are creating have become the largest, most potent political factor in this country, in Europe, arguably in the United States, in some other places too, not excluding at times in Australia.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this quite alarming rise in ethno-nationalism. How, in your new order, would we address this? We have politicians here calling for us to tear up the rule book, to leave the European Convention, to ignore the UN Covenant on Human Rights. So in a way, they're following your prescription.
They're not, actually.
They're not.
Quite the opposite.
And I'm interested, you didn't mention migration in the longer work. And I wondered why not.
Well, in the book?
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Oh, I missed it then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did, precisely because we think that climate change, global poverty, human development, humanitarian assistance, that's just a third world problem. But it's not, because it's our abject failure to address these issues that actually increases migration flows. So that's what I'm talking about, the interdependence and interconnectedness.
Okay, no, I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but what's your solution?
My solution is increase aid. Take climate financing seriously. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, we promised to provide climate financing, and we failed to meet the target of 100 billion. And it's a drop in the ocean. But we have shown no willingness, I'm sorry, Western democracies, Western liberal democracies have shown very little willingness to address some of these priorities in the global south. And so is it any wonder that the global south thinks, well, you're not interested in us, so why should we be interested in what happens in Ukraine?
When you say increase aid, I mean, it's gone down from this country in the United States dramatically and rather lamentably. But at a time when we were actually giving a substantial amount of aid, it didn't seem actually to be solving that problem, partly because it's a huge problem and it needs a very long-term solution.
Exactly.
Now, if you were a politician, where are you going to get the money from? I mean, we're talking about massive transfers, and then you need to make sure that it doesn't go down a black hole of corruption when it arrives.
Of course. This is a constant problem, isn't it? You need to find funds from somewhere. I think we have to reform our tax system. I would favor considerable redistributive tax reform. We need to generate more income because we can't just say, oh, well, look, we need to spend more on defense, so let's just cut the aid budget. Because ultimately, if we cut the aid budget, we get into a situation where eventually we're going to have to spend much more on defense to deal with some of these problems that you've identified. So it seems to me that we have to generate more income. We need to be more generous. We're a rich country. It's outrageous that our public services have degraded so badly. That's not just a function of money, although money is part of it. We do not make enough effort. We think in terms of classical economics. And so our default reaction is to go the austerity route. And so we think, well, oh no, we'll put people off. We need to make cuts. The problem is, in the end, you do less with, if you spend less, you'll do less with, you don't do more with less, you do less with less. And so I think it's really important that we expand we have to raise taxes, there's just no way around it. We need to generate more revenue, and we need to apply it to key areas. Now, some issues...
I'm going to stop you there because I want to cover two more subjects.
Yes, sorry.
But basically, we need more economic growth. I think I've heard that from our current government, too. I want to touch on the United States and then touch on China.
Okay.
These two rather big subjects. And perhaps I can fire the first one at you, Kadri. Bobo basically argues that we've seen the end of an American-led international order, but he also argues that a viable international order is contingent on the United States playing a leading role in it, but not a top-down role, which I interpret as meaning something that is neither Trumpism nor isolationism. As you look across the Atlantic, Kadri, what do you think the chances are of the United States playing that sort of a role, a more cooperative role, in which it uses its huge weight and its economic power, and perhaps is slightly more generous with it in the way that Bobo was just suggesting, but without having to run the system and be the hegemon? And do you think that's sellable to an American domestic electorate?
Who knows? But I think in theory that is possible. I think in theory that is even the logical outcome because America is a very powerful country, likely to remain, but its relative power compared to others is declining. So it probably should adjust its positioning accordingly. And I see actually no reason why it shouldn't get there eventually, but it probably will have to go through lots of turbulence, internal, first and foremost, maybe also external before that. So, I mean,
It's feasible, but we may have to be a bit patient.
we may have to be a bit patient, and of course, all sorts of developments can happen at that time. It takes for America to find its new place in the world.
Bobo, can you perhaps flesh this idea out a bit more and indeed feed China into it?
Sure.
Again, one of the things that we are looking at is President Xi having said that China, his objective is that China should be the leading global power by 2050. And there's much trepidation around the world about the rise in China's power and what it means and what China's ultimate ambitions and aspirations are. And of course, particularly in the United States, and the interplay to which you give a lot of attention in your book between China and the United States is at the heart of this. So before I throw it over to the wider audience, I wonder if you'd just like to address those interconnected issues.
We in the West tend to look at China as this behemoth, really, a juggernaut, unstoppable juggernaut, whose ambition is untrammeled. But in fact, we tend to overestimate China's qualities and attributes, exaggerate them, and we also underestimate its limitations. Coming back to Xi's sort of declaration about China becoming a global player, he didn't say the global player, he said a global player. And that's a really critical distinction, because China wants to be taken seriously at the global level. It is undoubtedly keen to promote its interests, and its interests are broadening, no question about it. Its capabilities are too as well. But China really has no interest in being the global leader, because the difference is, being a global leader or among the sort of global players, you have status, you have strategic flexibility, you have freedom of maneuver, all things highly desirable in Beijing. But being the global player means you have to take on the burdens and responsibilities of global governance. Everyone hates you, no one is grateful. And you have to divert attention, resources, and energy from priorities that matter ultimately far more, namely the longevity of the Chinese Communist Party regime. So China wants to be a global player. It wants to be the leading player in its neighborhood. It certainly wants reunification with Taiwan. And frankly, you'll have this even if Xi Jinping were to roll under a bus tomorrow and somehow miraculously China became a liberal democracy, they would still want all those objectives that I've identified. So we need to make a distinction between China's ambitions and China's capabilities. China wants to expand its capabilities, but right now it's quite happy for the US to be the global leader, not global hegemon, the global leader, but with China having much more freedom of maneuver and being able to cut from the sidelines.
Do you think that your analysis of China is shared or understood by leading figures in Washington at the moment, or are they looking at this in a very different way?
They look at it in a very different way. They see China as the only serious rival to the United States. I don't think there's enough effort put into trying to understand Chinese motivations, which is why I mentioned the importance of practical empathy in relation to self-interest. They don't really understand why China does what it does. They think, oh, China is growing at a rapid rate of knots, therefore it aims to displace the United States as the global hegemon. I think that's nonsense.
Right. That's a good point at which to widen the conversation. I think I'll go to the lectern because it's easier to see the audience from there. And also it takes me out of the firing line because you're not firing questions at me. You're going to fire them at Kadri and Bobo. We have no more than about 20 minutes if we're not to circumscribe your drinks, so we should go through this fairly rapidly. When you ask a question, because it's a bit difficult from here to see everybody, it would be very helpful if you could give your name, if you have an affiliation, give that too, and then ask your question. I see a gentleman there and then a lady there. If I can take you first, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Shapiro and was with the bank for 26 years. I'd like to, just because gadfly is in my nature.
Could you speak up a little because it's not very distinct here?
Is this on?
Yeah, that's good.
Is that better now?
Yes, that helps.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If I can just ask a very provocative question, which I look back at the last 100 years of history. American hegemony was an accident, and it took decades for Europe to rebuild. I look at a litany of long foreign wars in all parts of the globe. I see a Western value system that is only made possible by being able to export undesirable, cheaply paid labor without social support and pollution to countries like China. And I don't notice, even in the transactional nature of today, that the US is any less involved, quite the opposite. So my question is, did the rules-based international order ever really exist, at least as we imagined it?
Bobo. Okay, so I actually think the rules-based international order of the post-Cold War period was, as I mentioned earlier, an extraordinary moment, a combination of this where power, vision, and will all came together. But that was unprecedented, frankly. So in fact, to have that kind of universal rules-based order was a real aberration. What you had was you had competing value systems, and even during the Cold War, I mean, John Eikenberry talks about this, you had an inside order, which was the sort of the liberal democratic order within Western democracies. And then you had an outside order, which was, you know, the sort of the Cold War bipolar order. And what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the inside order became the outside order for a brief moment. But the problem there was that inevitably, once Russia and China began to recover, they were always going to challenge this monopoly rules-based international order. What really damned that order was the suicidal statecraft of Western governments over the subsequent 20 years. So the invasion of Iraq, the global financial crisis, the supine response to Putin's annexation of Crimea, the first Trump presidency, the Western response to COVID-19, and then, of course, the Biden failure. So what was surprising about the rules-based international order was not that it came under significant challenge, but that it unraveled so quickly from the zenith of its influence to what we see today.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, no order is perfect or absolute. I think in any arrangement you will find double standards and whatnot. So that obviously was the case here too. But what I sometimes wonder, maybe the victory of Western liberal order back in early 90s was too absolute. Maybe we would have handled the world better if we had felt a little bit more uncertain and humble.
That's right.
And here I come to Russia, which we have mentioned very little today, I sometimes wonder if things didn't start going wrong with Russia exactly at that moment when they subscribed to all Western rules and norms, which they were unable to follow, and that made them always feel like second-sort country in the Western system and made them a challenger over time, though fairly late in the day, actually. They tried to cope with the system for a long time. But also, we missed some important conversations. Russia said that, yeah, we think about everything like you, don't worry, whereas they didn't. No. So we should have tried to discuss much earlier how do they view the world and what to do. Now the assumption was that they are just like us, they will subscribe to everything the West does. And when I think we only realized that Russia is not going to democratize the way Eastern Europe did, we only realized that a couple of years ago. I think, Joe Biden, I actually liked certain things about Joe Biden. I think when he told Putin that we are not trying to change Russia, that was always a stupid idea. Let's try to fix these problems. I think that was the right thing to do, but it came much too late, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yeah, I think.
Thank you. Lady in the same row as Paul on the left, yes. And then Janet. And then... Right.
My name is Elena Rogers. I was born in a country which doesn't exist anymore, Soviet Union, thanks God for that. Now I'm an international development consultant, and my question is to Bobo. Sir Roderic mentioned in the passing about ethno-nationalism. Yeah. And I think none of you guys today mentioned or talked about populism and what has become of Europe with that. And Bobo was talking about self-interest and practical empathy. And I think about self-interest, it's the international governments are led by their voters. Mm-hmm. And voters, and that is the self-interest on the level of the government. So where would you find that practical empathy where we have at the moment in Europe with that ultra-right nationalist, including this country, Italy, France, Germany, and what would you do about it?
That's a great question. So when I talk about, in the book, I talk about the interconnectedness of interests. And I say basically, how do you try and convince people that their interests are interconnected? And I think there are two banes of modern existence. One is the deglobalization fallacy, the idea that somehow we are deglobalizing. Au contraire, we are becoming more and more globalized, more and more interdependent. The second thing is that narrow nationalism that you're talking about. And there are no easy solutions but what I would say is we need to bring the public much more into the debate. We have become so used to taking the public as either uninterested, ignorant, or idiotic. And we need to actually involve them much more in discussion. So during the Brexit debate, Michael Gove said, look, the public's sick of experts. But actually they're not. It's a Conservative Party of that time that was sick of experts. The public showed during the COVID-19 pandemic that it really did like experts. It valued the expert advice, and it contrasted this to the corruption of politicians and business interests. So of course there's a risk of involving the public much more in decision-making. It can become degenerate into populism. But in my opinion, if you bring the public much more into decision-making, then you improve the chances of making good decisions. So if we take just an example, one of the problems with the migration debate is that people think of migrants as freeloaders, leeches, parasites. And yet, the National Health Service, about which everyone makes so much of, is staffed by migrants from hospital porters to the most senior consultants. And yet no government, least of all this Labour government, has pointed this out, that we depend on precisely these migrants to staff the crown jewel of British society. And this is the thing, we need to bring the public much more into the discussion. And look, it's not a magic solution. You'll still have reactionary, populistic, nationalistic, racist views. But we can do better. Certainly keeping the public in the dark or somehow looking to seeing them more as a bump in the road, that's unhelpful. We need to be much more transparent and encourage much more accountability, both from the government side and from the societal side.
Kadri,
yeah.
Can we let Kadri, you have a very specific perspective on this because you have problems of ethno-nationalism embedded in your own country in Estonia. You probably have more involvement of the public because it's easier to do in a country of that size. But would you just like to comment briefly on this?
Yeah, it's Estonian perspective is, it's peculiar because I would argue that for a long time, actually, Estonia had, I think, liberal nationalism. I mean, we are patriotic Estonians. We are nationalists, but from early 90s, from 80s until really the immigration crisis, that made Estonians more open and more liberal because open and liberal world worked well for our nation. They went together. And it was only the immigration crisis of 2015 that gave rise to bad sort of nationalism and populism in Estonia. That's when they took off. But I also think important component here are mainstream political elites. You need good mainstream parties, and that's where I think the flaw is that mainstream political parties are not doing very well. And I think there are many reasons. In many countries, it's because, at least my own, I can see how previous generation of politicians was better than the current one. Current ones are better dressed, better educated, speak more languages, but many of them have only ever worked as politicians, started in sort of youth organizations and rose to prime minister. They don't have that real life experience that the previous generation had, even though they were worse dressed, spoke less languages, and behaved in an unruly manner in general. But also I think the world, it's really hard for politicians to deliver because many things people want from them are not in their powers to deliver at all because of the world is so interconnected. And I'm not sure if they can help that, but what they could help, they could at least try to understand these problems. Knowledge-based decision-making is also something that is important, whereas in many countries, and especially in nice liberal countries, I see sort of fashion-based decision-making. I mean, Estonia's energy policy suffers from that. We gave up coal because coal is dirty. We adopted gas. Then we gave up gas because it's bad, because it comes from Russia. We invested in solar. That's bad. It comes from China. We tried wind. Wind is ours. That's all domestic. And then we realized that you can't fuel your houses with wind alone because you need sort of something that stabilizes the market. And I don't think the politicians were on top of it. I don't think they relied on experts, and I don't think they knew what they were doing. though I have no doubts they try to do the right thing throughout. I think they mean well, but...
Yeah. We can take 10 more minutes, so we'll need to move fairly briskly. We haven't had a lot, as Kadri mentioned, a lot of discussion about Russia, which is slightly curious given the audience, but I'm sure there's scope for that. Janet Gunn, next.
Thank you. Janet Gunn, the BEARR Trust. My question is about Russia. The historian Sergei Rodchenko has recently released from archival research chapter and verse of how Yeltsin's foreign minister in the 90s sought, with documentary evidence, to get the US to agree that Russia, in the New World, post-Cold War, Russia and the US would basically rule the world together. And in the discourse today, and today specifically and in general, Russia is not counted in among the great powers. It's all about the US and China. And of course, Russia has committed a similar act of self-harm to what the UK did with Brexit, with its war in Ukraine, and has increased its isolation beyond anything recent.
That's a little unfair.
My question, sorry?
It's a little unfair to compare Brexit with invading Ukraine.
Okay, but I'm just using the word
Anyway,
self-harm.
Your question?
And my question is, has the reluctance of the rest of the world, and particularly the West, to accept Russia as one of the great world leaders increased its truculence and resentment and inclination towards aggression? And it's to either of the speakers.
Kadri, do you want to start off on that one?
Yeah.
I mean, should the world have accepted post-communist Russia with its crumbled economy, smaller size, but still with a Security Council seat, which was indeed fixed for it?
Yeah. No, of course not. And I mean, Russia wanted status like America's, but America's status at that point was, at least when it comes to Europe and many other parts of the world, it was based on America being attractive, which Russia was not. Russia had at the time very, very little to offer people other than, maybe literature connoisseurs or adventurers. I myself have always loved Russia. I went to Russia when other people stood in the queue behind Finnish consulate, but that was me. But I think also Russians themselves actually should have articulated their own interest in a more informed manner. You know, because the demand let's rule the world together, it's sort of stupid and also very generic. Figure out what your national interests are. And I mean, I've had long conversations about that with Andrei Kortunov, whom I really respect and who is a real liberal thinker among Russian foreign policy establishment, now quite silent for obvious reasons. And Andrei said that in Gorbachev times and the early 90s, it was shameful to even mention national interest because, you know, Gorbachev's elites, they were sort of technocrats. They thought that we have our only universal interest. We are going to conquer the moon and Mars, Venus, whatever. It was not a good tone to even ask, but what is our country? What is our role? What are our interests? And so interests only got defined later on by other types of people. I mean, first it was Yevgeny Primakov and then people who were worse than Primakov, I would argue. So yet again, I come back to, it's not just our failing, but it's also Russia's failing that they didn't think through their worldview and what they wanted. Maybe it's too much to demand. I mean, they had other more urgent worries at the time. But still, I think that things might have been different.
Bobo? Yeah, Janet, there is a sort of sense that they didn't get their just desserts in the 1990s, and this made them more resentful and more truculent. And yes, their economy was imploding and there was strategic retrenchment going on, but they sort of, it seemed to me, living in Moscow in the 1990s, that the view was, well, we've got credit in the bank, great power credit in the bank. Surely we deserve a little extra consideration and respect. But now I think it's slightly different. Now they think, well, yeah, we know the United States and China are the big two, but who's the number 3 power? Well, we are. We're more influential globally than any other third country. And so this is why they think, one can disagree with this, but I think they see when they talk about a multipolar order, they think of the United States, China, and Russia as the geopolitical pivot. The Chinese, I should add, think of a multipolar order as US, China, with other powers, including Russia, as several levels below. And that's one of the problems with the whole construct of a multipolarity. It means very different things to different people. But the Russians think that they deserve it. So it's not just that they're resentful. They're thinking, if not us, then who?
I'm going to take 2 more very quick questions. The gentleman there. Are there any at the back, to be fair? No, gentleman over there. So can I take you together, and then we'll have a joint answer. So microphone here first, please.
Hi, Lauren Gerlach with a question for Dr. Lo. You talked about the need to marshal big resources through a different approach to taxation. A skyrocketing level of global wealth is in the hands of a few people who are increasingly moving to Dubai or Monaco or wherever they simply don't have to pay tax. And I see no sense that they see themselves as in any way involved in solving these problems, except to the extent that they give a little pocket money to the charity of their choice for PR purposes. So how do you do this with the wealth just walking away? And just walking away from any sort of regime where it could be put to the type of uses you discuss?
Hang on, I'm going to take the other question.
Good question.
Thank you. Michael Mayo. Looking forward, do you think the US dollar will remain the global standard currency? And if not, what would replace it? And how would that affect the international order?
2 very simple, interrelated questions. You have 60 seconds each. Right.
You want to go first? Or?
Yeah, no, you go ahead.
You can give a one-word answer if you want. Yes.
All right, okay. So the type of sort of global billionaires that go to Monaco, they resent the very idea of taxation. It's not just that there's too much taxation, they just think that taxation is bad. But you'll recall that Oliver Wendell Holmes said, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. So these people, they're going to go to Dubai, Monaco, the British Virgin Islands, or whatever level of tax you give to them. So I don't think you can be psyched out, intimidated into thinking, oh, well, look, because if you pursued that argument to its logical extension, then you wouldn't have taxes at all. And that's clearly an unsustainable development. So you need to sort of balance risk here. You have to accept that some people are going to leave. Yes?
Those people have more of the wealth.
They do, but they're going to leave anyway.
That's more of the wealth that will leave with them.
I think you two can continue this conversation over a drink.
But, they're not... let me just try and answer this, because they are going to leave anyway. you can't really stop them because these people believe that it's not their social or political responsibility to pay taxes. So trying to then have a no tax or a very low taxation system is clearly unsustainable. You can't do that.
Right. I'm going to cut that one off and ask you to answer on de-dollarization.
De-dollarization. In my opinion, the US dollar is still going to be king in 20, 30 years. It'll be less hegemonic than it is now. So it won't be sort of like 90% of transactions taking place in US dollar. There'll be more local currencies used. But if the subtext to your question is the Chinese renminbi going to replace the dollar? Absolutely not. No, definitely not the euro either.
Kadri, final word with you on the dollar.
Yeah.
Stay off tax.
Right. I do worry about the growing inequality that the new economic model seems to bring about. But yeah, some people are in Dubai and others are here, and wealth concentrating into the hands of a few who are in Dubai. Not because I envy, I don't think that you can, I mean, things that I like can't be bought with money. You cannot buy good, nice sort of urban space with money. If you are wealthy, everyone else is poor. You will end up in a wealthy ghetto amidst sort of wasteland. If you want nice landscapes like the UK has, you would need to invest in society. So I don't envy them, but I think there is danger in that. And I think we need some new incentive to, new type of solidarity really, to keep our lifestyle going. But we all pay our small taxes, and there is some solidarity in insurance system, healthcare, etc. Otherwise, the future could be quite grim indeed.
Thank you very much. We have ranged far and wide and certainly earned a drink. My understanding from past years is that the EBRD have to ask us to leave at 8 o'clock, that is a hard stop for reasons of security and staff and the rest of it, which is why I'm afraid I have to cut the discussion off at this point, otherwise you don't get a drink. I would like to thank both of our panelists. A very special word of thanks to Kadri, because she has made a huge effort to be here, and she doesn't look as if she's half asleep, despite the fact that it's approaching midnight in terms of your body clock, and you had no sleep last night. And special thanks to Bobo. I do genuinely recommend his book, because it's not only brave, controversial, I read it with great admiration, it's also written with great clarity. It's a very easy read, and it's not 400 pages long. So thank you both very much indeed. A round of applause, please, for our two panelists.